I'm on my third video this week trying to keep up with all the latest and greatest economic news. It's really been a whirlwind, and if you've been following the headlines, you know that things have been unprecedented over the last week. The highs, the lows, the market volatility. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about my impressions, how I feel about what's going on, and how I think you should prepare for the next few months. I want to start by highlighting that the issue we're currently facing is not necessarily about tariffs. I think a lot of people are focusing in on the tariffs specifically, and I don't think that's really at the core of what's happening right now. Now, to give you some perspective on the tariffs, what happened is President Donald Trump imposed a series of tariffs across the board on all countries. There was a baseline 10% tariff applied to all countries, and then the rest of the countries were assigned a specific tariff percentage. Now, this percentage was claimed to be reciprocal. This number had more to do with the net import and export ratio that the United States has with a particular country. So if we are importing more goods, that means the tariff ratio is in favor of the other country. And so the reciprocal nature of how the president applied tariffs was to apply a much higher tariff to those countries importing more goods into the United States. Now, this at its core has everything to do with a trade imbalance that is seen as somehow being unfair to the United States. Now, some might argue that this is true, and especially in certain cases where countries have been taking advantage of this particular dynamic. But in general, this is a very unfair way to apply tariffs across the board. Just yesterday, the president called for a 90-day pause in terms of tariffs and is allowing for negotiation for many of these countries, with one notable exception, and that is China. His course on China was to increase the tariffs significantly above 100%, and so now there's a tit-for-tat sort of approach where China is imposing penalties, we're imposing penalties, and there's really no end-game in sight at the moment. That could change very quickly. I know that that is a part of the strategy currently at play, but right now there's no end in sight to that negotiation. Now, I want to take us a step back and talk about why I don't think this is about tariffs. I think personally that this entire situation is about our debt to GDP ratio. The United States has a tremendously large deficit right now. Given the current economic status, we have to finance that deficit. Now, we finance that deficit by selling treasury bills, which are basically bonds through the United States government. We sell those to other countries and to a variety of different entities. It's seen as very stable money, and so there is a percentage of interest applied to these bonds. Now, in addition to the stock market volatility, the bond market volatility was extremely unprecedented this week. Highs and lows, the yield was dropping and increasing in significant amounts. We won't go into the reasons behind this, but it's important to know that that volatility is very fragile. For the United States, we rely on being able to sell our treasuries in order to service our debt, in order to maintain the level of spending that we have to keep up all of the programs that we currently are running. Part of the game here with tariffs, I believe, is to drive the Federal Reserve to start lowering interest rates in order to incentivize additional liquidity into the market. Now, this would allow for more economic movement and additional printing of money, which may ultimately lower the rate to borrow money. Now, when this happens, this tends to fuel the economy, but there is a downstream effect that's very negative for the common everyday person, and that is the result of printing additional money, leading to inflation. The more money we have in circulation in the market, the less purchasing power the dollars you have actually have to buy goods and services. And although you'll see your accounts growing in a number, the nominal number of your purchasing power is actually quite a bit lower than it was had this not happened, this printing of money. And so as we progress over the next number of months during this 90-day pause, I'll be looking specifically at the types of agreements that are coming out through this tariff negotiation. What are countries agreeing to, and how is this helping to level the playing field in our trade deficit with certain countries? The most notable here is obviously China. Now, China has most definitely applied some very advantageous policies to trade with the United States for a very long period of time. And I do think it is time to reimagine that relationship. And so in some sense, I completely understand why the Trump administration is prioritizing this negotiation with China. I think it makes a lot of sense. Now, some might question the methods. Certainly, the extreme nature of this week demonstrates that the market is very, very fragile. And the president, although he thought he could continue at this very shock and awe pace, realized and decided to pull back once the bond market and other extreme financial indicators were showing us that this volatility is not sustainable in the long run. The global economic balance was really disturbed this week, and we've seen things that have never happened before in our markets. I think it's a fascinating time, and I'm hoping that at the end of the road, we do find some more equitable trade negotiations with China and other countries. But we have to keep in mind as a country that we have to be fair across the board with other countries as well. There are developing nations that certainly cannot afford a reciprocal tariff in the 50 to 60% rate. It's just not a tenable situation for most countries, and ultimately a negotiation has to take place. How we treat these countries now will be impacting us for decades to come. A lot of the international agreements that we have are shrouded in diplomacy, in various methodologies that have been established over time. These are unwritten rules of how you engage with countries, and there's a strong history behind the different types of precedents set when it comes to negotiation. In this particular case, the Trump administration has thrown all of that diplomacy and all of the precedents around negotiations internationally out of the window. He's completely rewritten the book here, and so it will be very interesting to see how this plays out in the long run, whether or not it really impacts the United States in a positive or negative way. It's not just about the numbers. It definitely is time for us to look at our deficit and to start cutting in significant ways. What the Department of Government Efficiency is doing, DOGE, to eliminate employment and fat around government programs is one method. It certainly is not being done in the most ethical or efficient way, but things are happening, things are changing, and some might argue that those changes will be significant, but they barely scratch the surface when we're looking at our debt to GDP ratio. And so in order to impact that debt, many changes are required. I do think the trade negotiations are a feasible path forward for improving that situation, but in the long term, there are many, many different changes that will have to be made. And the final thing I'll mention here is, in the form of tariffs, what this will do if tariffs do continue, especially with China and some other countries at these higher rates. Basically, this will apply a consumer tax. So those who want to buy products from these other countries are going to have to pay a consumer tax to get those products. All things considered, this is oftentimes a choice. It's a choice to buy whatever technology or piece of equipment or product that's being sold. Now, in some cases, these products are food. They're basic necessities. And people who have very tight budgets already do not have the money to necessarily pay inflated rates for these necessities. This includes cars. But in other cases, it might be for a luxury item that somebody doesn't need. And so in those cases, the consumer tax will be passed along to the consumer directly. This is one form of austerity that will be tough for the American public, but it's one that does seem to be viable and might offer some temporary pain for long-term gain. The truth is, I don't know how these things are going to work out. I don't think anyone does. There's lots of speculation and people who are telling you how things are going to go, where to put your money, and how to be thinking about this in the long term. I don't pretend to know any of these answers. I don't think it's possible to know these answers. And just watching this week, you can see that the shifts are significant in both directions, both up and down in terms of market volatility. So it's wise to be cautious, to take a step back, and again, just watch what's happening. Try to better understand how the mechanisms are operating behind the scenes and what's driving certain outcomes. I hope this video was helpful for you. We'll be back next week with another financial independence video. For now, I hope you have a great weekend and we'll see you then. Take care.